When we picture the Wild West, it's easy to imagine dusty towns, gun-slinging cowboys, swinging saloon doors, and rowdy poker games echoing through the clapboard buildings. But there's one thing that's often forgotten in the Hollywood version of the West: the food. What exactly did people eat when they saddled up to a saloon bar? Was it just whiskey and beer? Or did these rugged establishments offer more than just drinks and dance halls? The truth is, Wild West saloons were more than just watering holes. They were social centers, places of business, and for many travelers, a place to find a hot meal. Though hot and meal might be generous terms, depending on where you were. The food in Wild West saloons was a reflection of survival, resourcefulness, and rough living. Cowboys, miners, trappers, and rail workers burned thousands of calories a day doing hard, physical labor. When they rolled into town and headed straight for the saloon, they weren't just there to drink. They wanted food to fill their bellies and fuel their next journey. But this wasn't fine dining. Early saloon food was bare bones, utilitarian, and usually cooked over an open fire. Beans, biscuits, bacon, and coffee were the holy quartet of cowboy cuisine, and they made frequent appearances on saloon menus too. One of the most common meals served was chuck wagon stew, a mix of beans, salt pork, maybe some onions or garlic if the cook was feeling fancy, all stewed in a single pot. It was cheap, filling, and could be left simmering for hours while the barkeep poured drinks. Salt pork was a staple protein, essentially pork belly cured with salt, since refrigeration was rare. It was greasy, tough, and could last for months without spoiling. In some saloons, it was fried up and served with bread or biscuits. No butter, no jelly, just a slab of meat and bread to soak up the whiskey. Biscuits and cornbread were also common. The biscuits were usually the hardtack variety, dense, dry, and designed more for durability than flavor. Made from flour, water, and sometimes lard, they could break teeth if left to sit too long. Cornbread was more common in the southern and midwestern saloons, and if you were lucky, it was fresh and served warm. Butter? Maybe, if the saloon had a connection to a nearby farm. Most often, you'd get molasses or just plain old gravy, which could range from surprisingly good to suspiciously gray. Speaking of gravy, let's talk about meat, because nothing said luxury in the Wild West like a fresh cut of beef. If a saloon had connections to local ranchers or had its own livestock, you might find steak or beef stew on the menu. But it wasn't always cow. Game meat like venison, rabbit, squirrel, or even rattlesnake could find its way into a stew pot, depending on the region and what the local trappers had brought in. Buffalo was also a common meat in the earlier years of Western expansion, especially before overhunting decimated the herds. Some saloons even served buffalo tongue or hump roast as a delicacy. But meat wasn't guaranteed. Many saloon kitchens relied on canned or dried goods, especially in more remote mining towns where fresh food took weeks to arrive. Eggs and potatoes were another luxury, but when available, they were fried up and served with everything. Eggs were expensive, especially if they had to be shipped in from farmlands. Potatoes fared better on long journeys and could be boiled, mashed, or fried, if the cook had lard or fat to use. A common breakfast plate in a saloon would be eggs, potatoes, and whatever meat was left from the night before, sometimes with a biscuit, always with coffee. And then there were the beans. Oh, the beans. Pinto beans, navy beans, or whatever could be found, soaked overnight and cooked slow with bits of pork or beef fat. It was the quintessential cowboy food, cheap, filling, and easy to store in bulk. A big pot of beans might sit on the back burner all day, ready to be ladled out to anyone with a nickel and an empty stomach. Saloons often offered all-you-can-eat beans with the purchase of drinks, knowing full well that a full belly made for a longer stay. As towns grew and railroads connected the frontier to the east, saloon menus began to reflect more sophistication. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and spices slowly made their way west. In more established towns like Dodge City or Tombstone, saloons might offer roasted chicken, apple pie, or even oysters, shipped on ice from far-off coastal cities. Yes, you heard right, oysters in the Wild West. They were considered a luxury item and a way for wealthy patrons to show off. If you were in a fancier saloon, You might even find dishes like mock turtle soup, made from calf's head and flavored with spices and wine. Let's not forget the drinks, because while food was necessary, liquor was the star of the show. Whiskey was king, though it was rarely pure. Many saloons mixed their whiskey with things like chewing tobacco, black powder, or ammonia to stretch the supply or give it a kick. Locally brewed beer was common, though without refrigeration, it was served warm and sour. In larger towns, you might find German-style lagers shipped in from St. Louis or Milwaukee. Coffee, surprisingly, was one of the most important drinks in a saloon, especially for those who weren't drinking alcohol. It was boiled strong, black as midnight, and served all day. Beyond meals and drinks, saloons also served pickled items to accompany the alcohol. Pickled eggs, onions, pig's feet, and even sausages sat in jars behind the bar. They lasted forever and added salt to help patrons keep drinking. In fact, salt was a deliberate strategy. The salter the food, the more customers drank. So you'd find salted nuts, hard cheese, and salty meat skewers being passed around, sometimes for free. On special occasions, like a holiday, a big win at the poker table, or the arrival of a traveling entertainer. Some saloons laid out buffets or full-course meals. These would include roast beef, potatoes, beans, biscuits, and maybe even pie or cake if supplies allowed. These were the events people remembered. A full meal with meat, starch, vegetables, dessert, and coffee. That was a feast fit for a cattle baron. People traveled miles just for the promise of a proper dinner at a respected saloon. Food also varied based on who was cooking. In many frontier towns, saloons employed immigrant cooks, Chinese, Mexican, German, each bringing their own culinary touch. A saloon near a Chinese railway worker camp might serve noodles, stir-fried vegetables, or rice dishes alongside whiskey and beer. Mexican-inspired saloons featured tortillas, beans with chili, and tamales. The cultural melting pot of the West meant flavors weren't just bland and brown. They were occasionally surprising, even delicious. There were also traveling food vendors and chuck wagons parked near saloons, especially during busy nights. These vendors offered pies, sandwiches, or roasted peanuts to the patrons stumbling in and out. They were the food trucks of their time, making sure even the rowdiest gambler could find a midnight snack. But not all food experiences were positive. Food poisoning, spoiled meat, and filthy kitchens were part of the risk. Sanitation was not a priority. Flies swarmed, rats scavenged, and dishwashing was more of a suggestion than a practice. A saloon might use the same pan for meat, eggs, and gravy for days without cleaning. Spoiled milk, tainted meat, or rotten eggs could leave a person bedridden, or worse. Diners developed cast iron stomachs out of necessity, and food safety wasn't enforced until much later in the century. Despite all this, saloons became cultural icons, not just for what they served, but for what they represented. They were havens of warmth in a cold, uncertain world. You could walk into a saloon, cold and starving, and leave with a full belly, a hot drink, and a little human connection. Through music, a friendly card game, or the clatter of boots on the floorboards. Food in the Wild West wasn't fancy, but it was foundational. It was the glue that kept towns together, that gave weary travelers the strength to go on. So the next time you imagine a cowboy leaning on the bar, don't just think whiskey and cigars. Picture a steaming bowl of beans, a slab of salt pork, and maybe a greasy biscuit on the side. Think about the hard lives, the long rides, the dust in their teeth, and the hunger in their bellies. Food in the Wild West wasn't just survival. It was comfort, culture, and a small taste of civilization in a land that often had none. Whether it was a quick plate of eggs and coffee before heading out on the trail, or a lavish buffet on payday, the saloon menu was a mirror of the time, rugged, raw, and real. Imagine a man riding alone for days under the burning western sun, the dust clinging to his boots, the wind howling like a coyote at dusk. His stomach growls, his canteen is nearly dry, and the trail behind him stretches like an endless ribbon. When he finally sees the wooden sign of a saloon creaking in the wind, it's not just the promise of whiskey or a card game that draws him in. It's the hope of something hot, something filling, something that can satisfy the gnawing hunger in his gut. That's what Wild West saloon food was all about. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't pretty, and it sure as hell wasn't gourmet, but kept you alive. It was simple, practical, and built for the kind of folks who lived hard and rode harder. In the frontier days, food had one main purpose: survival. The people who rolled into saloons weren't looking for a fine dining experience. They were cowboys who'd just driven cattle across hundreds of miles, miners covered in cold dust and exhaustion, rail workers with blistered hands, and wanderers trying to find something that stuck. Every calorie mattered. You needed food that filled the belly, gave you energy, and didn't spoil in the scorching heat or bitter cold. Saloon food had to match that life. It had to be tough, just like the people eating it. The staples were basic: beans, bacon, biscuits, and coffee. Those four things showed up on nearly every saloon plate. Beans were the workhorse of the frontier diet. They were cheap, lasted forever when dried, and could be cooked in big pots that simmered all day. Toss in a bit of pork fat or salt pork, and you had a meal. It wasn't exciting, but it was warm, filling, and got the job done. Some cooks added onions or chili peppers if they were around, but most of the time it was just beans and whatever scraps of meat they could find. Salt pork deserves its own spotlight. It wasn't like the juicy bacon we think of today. It was fatty, chewy, and intensely salty. It was preserved in barrels of salt and could last for months, even years, without refrigeration. You couldn't eat much of it plain unless you had a strong stomach, but when fried up in a pan or chopped into beans, it gave everything a greasy, salty flavor that made you forget how basic the food really was. If you walked into a saloon and smelled fat sizzling on iron, chances were high it was salt pork hitting the skillet. Biscuits were another fixture, though calling them biscuits is generous by today's standards. These were often hardtack style or basic flour and lard creations. They weren't buttery or soft. They were dense, dry, and made to last. You soaked them in gravy or coffee just to get them down, but they did the job. You could pack a dozen in a saddlebag and still eat them a week later. Some cooks added baking soda to fluff them up a bit, but others didn't bother. When you're serving a room full of hungry, impatient men, quick and tough beats tasty every time. And then there was coffee, black, bitter, and always boiling. No matter how basic the food was, there was usually coffee. It was made strong, sometimes thick enough to float a horseshoe. Beans were boiled in big pots and reheated again and again until they were sludge. But in a world where sleep came lightly and morning started before sunrise, that cup of coffee was as important as any meal. It wasn't unusual for saloons to serve unlimited coffee refills just to keep the crowd coming back. A cup in the morning, a cup after a meal, and another before heading out into the unknown. It became a ritual as much as a necessity. Meat was rare, but when it was served, it was often tough cuts of beef, game, or salt-preserved meats. Steak was a luxury. If a saloon had access to local ranchers, you might get a pan-fried slab of beef, gristly and overcooked by modern standards, but heavenly to someone who hadn't had real meat in weeks. More often, it was stew. One pot, everything thrown in, bones, scraps, vegetables if available, and enough salt to keep it from spoiling. Stews simmered for hours, sometimes days, with the cook just adding new ingredients on top of the old. The longer it cooked, the more flavor it soaked up from the bones and fat. The stew wasn't always pretty, but it was hot and hearty. Game meat was another option: rabbits, squirrels, deer, sometimes even wild birds or snake. Hunters and trappers would trade fresh kill to the saloon for drinks or food. The cook would skin and gut it behind the building, toss it in a pot, and serve it up by the next mealtime. These weren't plated dishes with garnishes. They were hunks of meat in thick broth, maybe with a chunk of bread on the side. You ate it fast, you ate it hot, and you didn't ask too many questions. Dried goods filled in the gaps. Canned peaches if you could afford them. Dried apples stewed into a sweet mush. Molasses drizzled over stale bread to soften it up. Sometimes a saloon might have cheese, hard, salty, and meant to last. It wasn't uncommon to get a slice of cheese and a chunk of bread as a plowman's lunch with your drink. And speaking of drinks, food and alcohol were tied together. Some saloons offered a free meal with the purchase of enough whiskey. knowing full well the food was salty enough to keep you drinking all night. It was a smart business move. Most of the kitchens were little more than a corner in the back, an open flame, a couple of iron pots, and maybe a frying pan. Ingredients were kept in barrels, sacks, or tins. There was no refrigeration, and what passed for storage was a shady spot under a shelf. Hygiene wasn't a top concern. Flies were constant, and cleaning was basic. A rinse here, a wipe there, maybe a scrape with a knife. Food poisoning was a regular risk. But people were tougher, or at least they had to be. You ate what you were given and thanked the cook, even if it was just beans and bread. What made saloon food special wasn't the flavor, it was the function. It was the kind of food you could eat fast and forget about. Food that stuck to your ribs and kept you upright. If you were nursing a hangover, the greasy pork and thick coffee did wonders. If you were heading out into the snow or dust again, a bowl of stew gave you the energy to make it. Saloon owners knew their crowd. They didn't need fancy menus or exotic ingredients. They needed dependable food that could be made in bulk, served quickly, and kept customers coming back. In some saloons, especially in more remote locations, you might not even have a menu. The cook made one thing, and that's what everyone got. You didn't get choices, you got fed. And if you were lucky, it was hot. If you weren't, it was cold leftovers scraped together from the day before. But even then, that plate of food meant something. It meant safety, routine, a small taste of normal life in a world that was wild, chaotic, and often cruel. And for many, the simplicity of saloon food became part of the culture. It wasn't about fancy meals. It was about connection. Sitting at a wooden table, elbow to elbow with strangers, sharing a pot of beans, or breaking bread together created a sense of community. For a brief moment, everyone was the same, hungry, tired, and grateful for something warm. The stories flowed, the laughter came easier, and for a few minutes, the frontier didn't feel so far from home. Even the pickled items that sat behind the bar had their place. Pickled eggs, onions, and pig's feet sat in jars, preserved in vinegar and salt. They were cheap and lasted forever. They weren't appetizing to everyone, but they added variety. A shot of whiskey, a pickled egg, maybe a slice of hard bread, and that was dinner for many. It wasn't about taste, it was about survival. And survival was the name of the game. The Wild West was unforgiving. Weather, disease, violence, isolation, all of it wore people down. Food wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Every bite was a defense against the harshness of the land. The meals were built on what was available, what could be preserved, and what could be cooked in one pot. Every item had a reason. Beans for protein and fiber, salt pork for fat and preservation, biscuits for portability, coffee for alertness. It was all calculated, even if nobody said it out loud. That's what made Wild West saloon food what it was, a direct reflection of the life outside those swinging doors. It was rough, honest, and unpretentious. It told a story, not just of hunger and survival, but of the people who built towns from nothing, carved roads through wilderness, and faced each day with grit in their bellies. And every time they sat down to eat, no matter how plain the plate, it was a moment of peace in a world that offered precious little. The saloon may have started as a rough and ready watering hole for cowboys and drifters, but by the height of the American frontier era, it had transformed into something far greater than a place to grab a drink and a plate of beans. It became the beating heart of the town, a crossroads where cultures met, stories were exchanged, and flavors from across the globe began to seep into the dust and grit of the Wild West. What began with a pot of beans and a slab of bacon slowly turned into a culinary experiment born out of necessity, diversity, and the changing face of the frontier. As towns grew and railroads stretched across the plains, saloons began to evolve from survival stations into cultural hubs, places where the menu could surprise you just as much as the clientele. In the early days, most saloons kept things simple. Salt pork, beans, and coffee, just enough to keep the working man going. But as settlements matured into towns and commerce expanded, so too did the expectations of what a saloon should offer. No longer just for lonely ranch hands and thirsty miners, saloons had to start appealing to traders, business owners, immigrants, and even the occasional politician or traveling preacher. To thrive, they needed more than whiskey. They needed atmosphere, entertainment, and increasingly food that could please a crowd with different tastes and backgrounds. What made this transformation possible was access. The expansion of the railroad in the mid to late 1800s turned once isolated outposts into bustling hubs of activity. Goods that once took weeks to arrive by wagon could now come in a matter of days. Iceboxes, meat lockers, and dry goods shipped in from the East Coast or the Gulf of Mexico brought new ingredients, and with them, the ability to cook beyond the basics. Suddenly, you could walk into a saloon and find dishes like roast beef with pan gravy, fresh oysters shipped from New Orleans, or even a slice of apple pie that tasted like home. One of the most surprising shifts in saloon dining was the introduction of full-course meals. In more established towns, places like Dodge City, Deadwood, or San Francisco, saloons doubled as restaurants, offering meals that rivaled some urban establishments back east. Dinner wasn't just stew anymore. Patrons might be served a menu that included soup, a choice of meat or fish, vegetables, fresh bread, and a dessert, often accompanied by music from a piano or a small band playing in the corner. These meals became especially popular on weekends or during holidays, when a saloon transformed into a space for celebration and community gathering. Locals would dress in their finest dusty suits and long skirts, exchanging silver coins for a taste of something rare, a proper dining experience. Another key factor in this evolution was the growing presence of immigrants who brought their own culinary traditions to the West. Chinese cooks, in particular, played a major role in diversifying the frontier diet. Hired not only in mining camps and railroad crews, they also found work in saloon kitchens. Their stir-fried vegetables, rice dishes, dumplings, and noodle soups began to appear on menus, sometimes subtly blended with traditional American fare. Patrons might not have known exactly what they were eating, but they knew it was good and different. The flavor of soy sauce, ginger, or sesame oil added a new dimension to plates that had once been monotonous. In the Southwest and along the Mexican border, another powerful influence took root. Mexican cooks introduced tamales, enchiladas, chili con carne, and fresh corn tortillas to the saloon scene. What was once foreign quickly became popular, especially among the working class. A hot tamale paired with a shot of tequila or mezcal offered something bold, spicy, and deeply satisfying. Chili, in particular, became a saloon staple, earning nicknames like Texas Red and gaining a reputation as the go-to dish for anyone needing to warm up fast. Made with beef, beans, and fiery peppers, it was cheap to make and easy to serve. Some saloons even turned it into a signature dish, drawing crowds with their own secret recipes. Even German immigrants left their mark. In towns where they settled in larger numbers, saloons began to offer sausages, sauerkraut, rye bread, and dark, malty beers. Pretzels, pickled herring, and boiled potatoes might also appear, especially in saloons that doubled as beer gardens. These establishments weren't just serving food. They were recreating a taste of the old world in the middle of the frontier. A man might step off a cattle drive and walk into a room filled with the smells of bratwurst and fresh bread, a beer stein in hand, and feel like he was transported to another country. As more women entered the frontier, whether as business owners, teachers, performers, or wives, saloon menus adapted again. Family-style meals, lighter fare, and even afternoon tea services appeared in some of the more refined establishments. Some saloons hired professional chefs or trained cooks to elevate their cuisine. Where once a crusty biscuit and burnt coffee would suffice, now there were fresh rolls, pastries, and pies. Fruit cobblers made from canned peaches or locally foraged berries became common, served warm with sugar sprinkled on top. For those who could afford it, a slice of pie and a hot cup of spiced tea became the perfect end to an evening. Then there were the delicacies, the dishes you wouldn't believe ever made it to the Wild West. One of the most unexpected was oysters. Yes, oysters in a saloon, sometimes hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. Thanks to railroads and packed ice, oysters could be shipped from the Gulf Coast or the Pacific and arrive fresh within days. High-end saloons used them to attract wealthy clientele, offering them raw on the half-shell or fried golden and served with sharp horseradish sauce. A plate of oysters and a glass of chill beer became the ultimate symbol of class and status in a place otherwise built on dust and grit. Mock turtle soup was another upscale option served in certain saloons. Despite the name, it didn't involve turtle. It was made from calf's head or organ meat and seasoned with wine and spices. Rich, hearty, and full of flavor, it was considered a delicacy. So were prairie oysters, which weren't oysters at all, but rather bull testicles sliced, breaded, and fried. A dish born from ranching culture and equal parts joke and tradition. Patrons with a strong stomach and a sense of humor might order them for sport, to impress a friend, or to challenge a rival. While the food diversified, so did the presentation. Some saloons offered buffet-style service, where patrons paid a flat fee for all-you-can-eat meals. Others provided table service with printed menus, often listing not just food, but also wine pairings or cigar options. The tables were laid with cloth, silverware, and, on occasion, even candlelight. In these moments, the Wild West Saloon didn't feel like a dusty bar. It felt like a social club, a place to impress a date, a business partner, or a newly arrived guest from back east. At the heart of this transformation was the saloon's role as a cultural bridge. It brought together people from different lands and let them share more than just drink. It let them share flavor, tradition, and identity. The cook in the back wasn't just a laborer. He or she became a translator between worlds, turning ingredients into stories and recipes into shared experience. Every new dish that arrived on the table brought a bit of its homeland with it. It was one of the few ways a person could travel across the globe without ever leaving town. Food also became a means of competition. Saloons in the same town began to outdo each other, not just with entertainment or drink prices, but with their food. One might advertise the best chili west of the Mississippi, while another promised steak so tender you don't need teeth. Word spread quickly in these small towns, and a good cook could make or break a saloon's reputation. Hiring a chef with a signature dish became a business decision as important as hiring a skilled bartender or pianist. All of this meant that by the end of the 19th century, a saloon wasn't just a place to dull your senses. It was a destination for flavor, for memory, and for surprise. A weary traveler might expect the usual beans and bacon, only to be served a steaming plate of beef stroganoff or a buttery apple tart. A miner coming in from the hills might find himself seated next to a visiting Englishman eating roast duck with plum sauce. These weren't everyday occurrences, but they were possible, and in the Wild West, that possibility meant everything. What defined this evolution wasn't just variety, it was the spirit of the frontier itself. Resourceful, open to change, and always chasing the new. Just as the people of the West adapted to their environment, so too did the saloons adapt to their patrons. The food became more than survival. It became expression, a reflection of the melting pot that was the American frontier, and a symbol of the transition from raw wilderness to settled civilization. In the end, saloons that survived weren't just the ones with the strongest whiskey or the best poker table. They were the ones that recognized the power of food to bring people together, to tell stories, and to make a dusty wooden room feel like home. Whether it was a steaming bowl of chili, a crisp German lager, a plate of tamales, or an oyster served on a bed of ice in the middle of the desert, the saloon became something more than a bar. It became a table set for the world.